We're finishing off the month of child abuse prevention and awareness, and it's definitely flown by, but we couldn't have finished it without having Shen here with us. Many of you have also been part of our trauma-informed master classes, so you've had the opportunity to interact with Shen and hear her amazing workshops that she provides for us. But let me give you a little background on Shen. Shenandoah Chefalo is a graduate of Michigan State University. She holds a Bachelor of Arts with a major in interdisciplinary studies in social science. She's a certified coach and a member of the Foster Leaders Movement. She is a sought-after speaker on topics including youth in foster care and the science and the impact of trauma and resilience on various social issues. She's also a trainer and consultant that helps private governmental and public organizations implement sustainable trauma-informed strategies that are focused on learning new skills as well as organizational culture changes and shifts. She has been featured as a consultant and trainer nationally and internationally. Excuse me, sorry. Wow. I apologize. After spending nearly 20 years as a law office administrator, Shenandoah became unsettled by the ever-revolving door of people into the criminal justice system and set out to find a way to change it. Excuse me, sorry. Okay. A survivor and alumni of the foster care system, Shenandoah Chefalo is also the co-founder of the 4600 and Counting, a grassroots movement to bring awareness and change to the missing youth of foster care. In addition to her multiple award-winning book, Garbage Bag Suitcase, she also wrote an ebook entitled Setting Your Vision and Defining Your Goals, and is also working on her next manuscript, Hiking for Stillness. Her children's series will launch, or has launched as the 2022, Best Bunny, The Adventures of Lil Shen, and her inspirational sidekick, Bunny Best. Again, help me welcome Shen, our great, great friend here, and thank you for being with us today.
Sylvia, thank you. Stephanie, thank you. I feel like I'm amongst family now. It's funny how that can happen so quickly. I'm super appreciative that you all invited me to be part of your awareness to Child Abuse Prevention Month as we kind of wrap up the month of April. And as many of you know, we head into May, which is foster care awareness. So I sort of feel like it's a good bridge for our conversation and wrapping up Child Abuse Prevention Month and thinking about Foster Awareness Month, which is coming up on May 1st. And so with that, I just want to share with you a bunch of things. Everyone said, Shen, you have as much time as you want. And what I really love to do is have a discussion. So I've put together a little bit of a presentation, and then I'd love for us to do some question and answers, because I'm very fortunate to be doing a lot of work in trauma-informed work throughout the state of California right now. And I think that California is really poised to do some really amazing things in how it looks at family first prevention, implementation, and a lot of new legislation that's on the ballot in the state of California as well. So Sylvia gave me a great introduction, which I appreciate, Sylvia, thank you. But let's start at the beginning. Michigan State, go green. I think we should all celebrate our alma maters as much as I celebrate mine. And I love football, and the NFL draft starts tomorrow, so I'm super, super excited, even though I'll be watching it from my hotel room with a beer, but that's where I'll be to do it. Michigan State is super special to me, but maybe not for the reasons you think. So although I love sports and I love our teams, it's special to me for another reason that I'll circle back to in just a minute. And so what I want to tell you about is sort of my real life, right? Like, bios are great. They tell you about like these things you've accomplished, but I'm really a lot more than those things, right? And so when we talk about our own intersectionality and where we are in our lives. So I have an amazing 20-year-old daughter. In fact, in less than 10 days, she'll be 21, which is a little frightening for me to say out loud. Who lives in London, England. She actually graduated from high school in 2020 during COVID, and she moved to London to start college in the middle of the pandemic on her own. We were not allowed to go with her because of the pandemic, and she's been successfully living there as an art student since. I'm looking forward to her senior year because then I know she'll be on her way home, although she's actually thinking of moving to LA. So you guys will be inheriting another great artist in your area soon enough. And I have a spouse who is still a practicing criminal defense attorney in a very rural location in Michigan. And we're a small little close-knit family. But in the community, in the rural community that my daughter grew up in, everybody knew me as either Sophia's mom, because at the age of 10, she started her own business where she was making $40,000 a year as her own business person. If you've not parented a child who makes more than most of your friends and adults, it is a challenge all in of itself. I actually don't recommend it. It was a really challenging time for us. And people who didn't know me as Sophia's mom knew me as Jerry's wife, because my husband is a practicing criminal defense attorney in a very rural area. Everybody knows him, and he's often on the news. Unfortunately, not for the great things that my daughter was featured on the news for, but because of his clients and the cases that he's involved in. And so no one really knew my story before that. When my daughter turned 10 years old, we decided to give up Christmas and everything that is Christmas. No tree, no presents, no lights, no Christmas music, no parties, nothing. And instead, we decided to travel together and create memories together. And that has brought us all over the world, including in the middle picture where we're actually in Madrid, Spain. And right before the pandemic, to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, Africa, to raise awareness for youth aging out of foster care. And so this really amazing life. I travel around the world, both personally and professionally. And I love everything that I do. The thing is that nobody really knew the new story. This is my view out my kitchen window when I'm at home, by the way. My little pet Bernie, those of you who've been in masterclass have gotten to meet him once or twice. So everybody thought I had sort of this white picket fence story, including my husband and my daughter. My husband and I have been married for 25 years, but it wasn't until 2011 that I disclosed to my husband about my life before meeting him. And so to answer everyone's first question, how does a white lady like me get the name Shenandoah? Really simple, just be born in California in the 70s. You too can get a unique name if your mom struggles with addiction. This is how you get the name Shenandoah. And so I was born in actually San Diego, California in the 70s, and we lived all over California and all over the Southwest. So I have lived in San Diego. I spent most of my youth in Los Angeles and Long Beach, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Arizona, Salt Lake City, Boulder, Colorado, etc. We moved frequently and often, but it was a story that I was running from. And it was a story that I really told nobody. I had a very nomadic childhood. We moved over 50 times in 35 different schools before the age of 13. We were often homeless. My mom suffered from multiple mental health issues and addiction issues. We were homeless, a motel family. We lived out of our car for a good number of months and years. And ultimately, as we were on this sort of reverse Oregon Trail, moving from the West Coast back to the East Coast, my mom is originally from the state of Michigan. We returned just before I turned 13 years of age. My mom sent me back to California to stay with some friends and family for the summer. And when I came back to Michigan, there was nobody at the airport to pick me up. This was long before 9/11, a little old and dated, And I actually convinced the flight attendant to let me leave and get on the city bus to go find somebody that I knew. And this is really an issue that's close to my heart. Sylvia mentioned in the bio that one of the organizations I helped found was hashtag 4600 and counting, because we know that a large majority of children in the foster care system will end up in child sexual exploitation and trafficking. And one of the big reasons is that we don't keep track of kids. And so even though I wasn't in the foster care system at the time, I think it's really important to point out all the times in which children can be really vulnerable. And so it's a really important issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention that it should. And so the flight attendant allowed me to leave. She allowed me to get on the city bus, and I took the city bus to the only person I actually knew in the state of Michigan, which was my maternal grandmother. And I showed up at my maternal grandmother's home, who at the time was living in a senior housing community. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You have relatives that live in similar housing. You know, she had a nice little 1-bedroom apartment, and she had a little kitchenette, but would get together with the other people in the complex to do meals and activities and events. And so I showed up, and my grandmother, of course, welcomed me in. And my mom didn't appear. And a day of staying at my grandmother's turned into a week, and a week was starting to turn into a month. And as you can imagine, a very young, almost 13-year-old girl with a significant history of trauma does not blend into a senior living community at all. And the people who were running the facility were actually getting ready to evict my grandmother if she didn't find a placement for me. They felt that I was not just a guest, but that I was turning into a resident. And so a 12-year-old, almost 13-year-old girl had to make a really lifelong decision. Do I become homeless with my grandmother, who was ill and frail? I had been homeless numerous times. Most of my existence to that point was me caring for myself. My mom had disappeared numerous times throughout my childhood, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. The longest for over a month, when she was incarcerated and I was left at home and didn't know where she was for 6 weeks, right? Because we didn't always ask parents if they had children at home when we incarcerate them. We still don't always ask, and children very often get left home alone while a parent shows up for sentencing in a case. So that was an option, to become homeless with my grandmother. The other option was to call the police and to be placed into foster care. Now, when I talk about this story and share this story quite often, most people say, that's a pretty easy decision. You should obviously call the authorities. It was not an easy decision for me. And it was not an easy decision for lots of reasons, and lots of really complex reasons. One, I grew up in places and areas where the police couldn't be trusted, not just because I was taught to mistrust them, which I indeed was, but also I had witnessed them not give protection when needed, right? They had been called when my mom had been brutally beaten by a boyfriend and no one was arrested. I had called the police when my mother had been brutally raped in front of me, and no one was arrested and nothing was done. In fact, my mom was blamed for the incident and how she could allow something like that to happen with a child in the home. I had watched police target individuals in the communities in which I lived in. And so I had a great mistrust of police that was both justified and unjustified. My mom had taught me from a very young age to lie to authority figures, to lie to police officers, nurses, teachers. And in fact, I was taught so well to lie to authorities that even when I ultimately entered the foster care system, nobody could figure out what my actual last name was, because we had been taught to lie about all the facts of our life. That in fact, I would age out of the foster care system under a last name that was in fact not my last name. And so all of these are contributing factors to my decision. You tie into that I'm a 12-year-old girl many females on this call today, right? Like 12-year-old girls under the best circumstances aren't really the best decision makers in life. And I was no different, especially coming from a dramatic and traumatic childhood. But I had one thought in my head, and this is why the images we see in media, in my opinion, matter so much. Because the only foster kid that I knew was this cute little curly haired redhead girl named Annie. And everything sort of worked out for Annie. Although she was placed in an orphanage, she eventually got Daddy Warbucks and Sandy the dog and lived in a mansion and lived happily ever after. And I think that's important because that's what convinced me to call the authorities on myself and to enter foster care was Annie. I had this envision, maybe not of the mansion. I knew that that was sort of the Hollywood storybook ending, right? But I did think these must be the best parents, right, that we can have in our foster care system. And that I would have all of those opportunities I had so wanted throughout my whole life at that point. And so the authorities came, a police officer arrived with a social worker. And after a short 20-minute call, it was decided that I would be placed into foster care. I went with a social worker after the end of that 20-minute interview with literally all of my belongings in a garbage bag. And I would never again see my grandmother alive. I would never again see anyone from my biological family until after I aged out of the foster care system. I was placed in the foster care system. I remained in the foster care system until I aged out halfway through my senior year of high school at the age of 18. I had over 50 placements in my 5 years, and I attended another 15 schools in that time period. I think this is really important to talk about because we often think that abuse ends when we remove children from their homes. And very often it is just a new form of abuse that begins. And so I think this is a critical component in Child Abuse Prevention Month to talk about the trauma that occurs with removal and the trauma and the abuse that continues even when we're removed from our original abusers. So I had a very traumatic time before foster care. That trauma continued well out of foster care for me. And as I was getting closer to the age of 18, as I mentioned, I was going to turn 18 halfway through my senior year. And this is a really important thing because we wonder why foster kids don't get their high school diplomas. And this is one of the major factors that plays a role in this. My big dream was to have a high school diploma and to continue working at the hardware store that I was working at in high school. I didn't have dreams of college. I just thought if I could get my high school diploma, it would be the first person in my family to ever do so. And that I could really prove something to everybody about my resilience and about my ability to succeed. And so that was my plan. My plan was to try to graduate high school, but turning 18 in a very rural part of our nation, there was no public transportation. There was no housing near my high school. There were a lot of issues that would prevent me from doing that. And so I was trying to come up with a plan that would keep me housed so I could graduate from my high school because I knew moving high schools would cause me to lose credits and that I wouldn't graduate. So there were all these things at play. I eventually had the thought of asking my last set of foster parents if I might stay with them if I continued to pay them the subsidy that they'd been receiving from the state of Michigan. My foster parents agreed with one slight exception that they get a $50 a month raise so that I could stay. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but to a kid who at the time was making $3.25 an hour, $50 is an extreme amount of money because it takes a lot of hours at $3 an hour to get to $50. And what that caused was me to make a choice. to either put everything I had into graduating high school or to become homeless and become a college dropout. I decided that I would do whatever it took to make the extra money to try to get my high school diploma. And I did that. But that meant that I didn't have my basic needs met. I didn't have deodorant. I didn't have shampoo and conditioner. I very often didn't have feminine hygiene products. And you can imagine to be a high school kid who is not clean, who doesn't have clean clothes, who doesn't have access to toothbrush and toothpaste, just how popular that makes you and how excluded you become when the thing you need the most is to be included, right? To help heal from your trauma, from someone who already has attachment issues, from somebody who already has abandonment issues, how this just exacerbates that pain one step further. But what the $50 did allow me to do was to potentially graduate from high school. And that was it. That was my dream. I was fortunate that I had a teacher who took an interest in me during my senior year of high school and wanted me to make plans beyond high school. I went to a high school that a lot of wealthy kids went to, and almost everybody in my graduating class was going off to college, but I never saw that as my path forward. And this teacher just couldn't see any other path forward for me. And so she encouraged me to go down to my guidance counselor and talk about where I could apply to college, even if it was just our local community college. My teacher was an interesting woman. You guys can't tell from here, but I'm actually very tall. I'm almost 5'11", and my teacher was, barely 5 foot, maybe 75 pounds soaking wet. But she had this little body and this big personality. And if she asked you to do something, you just did it without question. And so when she told me to go speak to my guidance counselor, I did. And I made the appointment. I went down, sat across from him, and he took one look at me and my records. And Shen, people like you don't go to college. People like you learn to serve people like me. Now, when we're all together, I usually hear a few groans about what this man had to say. But the truth was, I had heard that a lot, right? He was maybe the first one who had the courage to directly say it to my face. But in all those years of sitting outside the courtroom every 90 days for my review hearing, plenty of judges, plenty of attorneys, plenty of social workers and caseworkers and foster parents and other people tangentially related to my case were waiting for me to turn into my mother. We say this about kids every day, right? Girls turn into their mothers and boys turn into their fathers. And even when we don't say it to them, our actions, our tone, our mannerisms say it. And so I knew everybody had little expectations of me. And when he said that to me, I wasn't surprised at all. And in fact, as an 18-year-old kid, I agreed with him. I begged him to tell Mrs. Clark himself so that I wouldn't have to tell her that people like me weren't made for college. People like me were made to do the jobs nobody else wanted to do and to just be thankful that we were getting by. He sent me back to Mrs. Clark's room with the instructions that I had to tell her myself. And when I returned to Mrs. Clark's room, she was really excited to find out where I was going to apply for college. I told Mrs. Clark the same story that I just told you. And if you remember the sort of 80s horror movie where the little girl's head can spin around and spew stuff, that's sort of what Mrs. Clark looked like on the day I told her. She was really flabbergasted that I wouldn't apply to college. And so she, on her own, before the internet, wrote to various colleges, state universities around our state and our community colleges asking for applications. She was convinced that I should go to college, and she was going to make that happen one way or another. Mrs. Clark got 4 or 5 applications for me. I was under strict orders to fill them out. But when I looked at every single college application, the first thing at the top of it was that there was an application fee due with every application. Before you even get to writing your name, there was an application fee due. And the truth is I couldn't even afford deodorant. So there was no way that I could afford a $45, a $55, a $65, $125 application fee to college. And the truth is even if I could have afforded it, I would have bought toothpaste and feminine hygiene products and not a college application. And so I brought back the applications to Mrs. Clark. They were blank. She was very upset that I hadn't filled them out. And when she began questioning me as why, I just explained to her that people like me don't go to college, that we don't have the money to go to college, and that to prove the point, I can't even afford the application fee to apply. Out of the kindness of her heart, Mrs. Clark wrote a check to one of the universities, which happened to be her alma mater, under the condition that I would go to her alma mater in her honor. And so I'm fortunate to say that Mrs. Clark was a graduate of Michigan State University, and that's why I'm a graduate of Michigan State University. And it's why I get to talk about Michigan State University so much. And so most people think that that's my happily ever after. Here, we took this girl who had been physically, sexually abused, this girl who had been physically and emotionally neglected, and we got her into college, and that's a win. And the truth is that's not where my story ends. In my first 90 days on campus, I tried to commit suicide 3 times. I was in a tremendous amount of pain, physically, emotionally. I was an 18-year-old girl trapped in a 13-year-old's mind, right? I was physically 18, but mentally I was a 13 or 14-year-old. While I had a lot of street smarts, I didn't know how to have friendships. I didn't know how to have relationships. I didn't know how to show up and be an adult. I had no financial literacy. I had no ability to really care for myself in the way that I needed. And I had no resources to do so. It eventually took me 8 years to graduate from Michigan State University. It was a bumpy road. I'm sure they were glad that they were rid of me finally, because I was sort of this fungus that was hanging around that they just couldn't get rid of. You know, I wasn't an exceptional student. I struggled tremendously to try to get through that. But in the process of my freshman year at Michigan State, it was really clear that I needed a job, that the dorms did not serve food over the weekend, that I had limited access to the things that I needed to survive. And so I went to apply for a job. And for me, this is an especially tender memory, as we've just had a mass shooting on the Michigan State campus that occurred in the student union in a place that probably saved my life many years ago. So for me, this is an especially tender story at this moment in time. So I went to that student union, and there were 2 jobs at the time posted on the board. One was a minimum wage job, $3.25 an hour, with a bunch of skills I didn't have. The other job paid $1,000 a week. And this is why financial literacy is critical, everybody. Everyone thinks it's a joke until it's not. I looked at that $1,000 a week job, and my thought process was this. That's my plan B. I'm going to try to go to this interview for the minimum wage job. And if I don't get it, and I'm likely not to get it because I don't have the skills, the other job will be my plan B. I went to the interview for job A, and I actually ended up getting it. Job A was as a receptionist in a law office in downtown Lansing, Michigan, our capital. And I got that job because I was a skinny, not very bright 18-year-old girl working for a lot of old guys, where my job description was to smile and wear a skirt every day. I am convinced to this day that if I was of any other race or sexuality, if I was heavy, I would have probably not gotten that job. It turns out that I was really good at the job, that I learned quickly. I moved from that law firm to other law firms, and I became a legal secretary. Then I became a paralegal. And by the time I was 21, I became a law office administrator, hiring and firing attorneys in actually a very large law firm. I hired a law clerk one day that I fired 24 hours later because he was terrible at his job. And then I stayed married to for 25 years. So, right. And we decided to open our own law practice, have a daughter, and here we are. You know how that story ends. For a moment, though, I want to talk about the other job, because the other job only required me to take my clothes off and dance for strange men. And I think it's important that we talk about that, because most 18-year-olds faced with that decision would have gone to that job first. And I think that version of me exists. In fact, I know that version of me exists because I've met that girl. And it's how long of doing the job as a stripper before you pick up a drug addiction, before you pick up the abusive boyfriend, before you pick up the unwanted pregnancy, before your drug or alcohol addiction leads to an arrest. I think it's important for us to talk about that, because it's so easy to judge that woman at 27, at 38, at 51, and say she just made a bunch of bad choices in her life, but they were her choices to make. And the truth is sometimes it's not our choices. Sometimes you have people living in active trauma who are forced into situations in which there isn't an alternative, that they do things out of necessity, out of the ability to survive, and then those choices lead them to some pretty bad and dark places. And while it's super easy to judge them when they're later in life, it's when we back up and hear and understand what people have been through and the ability to have some empathy that we can really make changes. We shouldn't have 18-year-olds who are making choices by themselves where those are the only options. We shouldn't have 18-year-olds who don't have any mentors to help them, especially when those 18-year-olds have been in a system where we have said, we'll care for you, and then you turn 18 and we suddenly stop caring for you. Once we say we're your family, family's forever. Family doesn't just get to stop because it's convenient or because a government system says so. Family means there's people there when you get married, when you have your first child, when you stumble, when you fall, that can give advice and assistance the whole time. So if we're going to sever a relationship with biological families, then we have a duty to step in and give advice so that we don't have 16, 17, and 18-year-old kids making life and death decisions. There is no reason why at the age of 12, I had to make a decision to report myself to foster care. That shouldn't be something that children have to do. They shouldn't be placed in that position to become adults in their own lives when they are still children. And for me, if you're under the age of 30, you are still clearly a child, right? We all need it. I am much older than 30, and I still very much feel like a child in many ways. And so my college experience didn't save me. I was homeless throughout college. I was homeless even while I was working a full-time job. I was homeless because the dorms closed on Thanksgiving break and the dorms closed on Christmas break, and there was nowhere to go. I had no family to go to. I had no friends in which I could show up and share a meal with them. And so all of these things that happened to me, even after I aged out of the system, etched in me this desire to never talk about my time in foster care, to never talk about the abuse that I endured. And so I kept my head down, not telling anybody what I was doing. And before I knew it, a decade had passed, and soon 2 decades had passed, and I had never disclosed to anybody the things that mattered to me. And that continued. I met my husband, we opened our own law office, and we began seeing whole families that were suffering in the criminal justice system. And what we really began to notice is that all the issues, all the things that we could point to, substance abuse, homelessness, incarceration, unemployment, the lack of education, early pregnancies, the truth is that all stemmed back to early childhood adversity. And it became quite clear when I met a young woman in my office who was my same age. And she was the woman who took the alternative path for me. We were the same. And she was in our office because she was getting ready to spend the next 25 years in prison, leaving her 4-year-old son at home. And she said something to me that changed my life forever. She was the only person at the time that I had disclosed my experience to. And she said, Shen, if you don't talk about this, you are devastating a generation of people. People must know that there's things that we can do to change this and that there's different paths forward. And so when she said that to me, a new thing bubbled up and I realized that I had to write a book. Now, I had never dreamed of being an author or writing a book, or much less several books at this point in my life. But I knew that I had to, because I knew that we had to change the things that we were seeing. I knew that when we look at the current statistics of today, we have over 500,000 kids in foster care, that 50% of the girls who age out will be pregnant by 19 and a half, that 50% of the boys who age out will be incarcerated within 2 years with a felony conviction. When we look at death row inmates across the United States, that 74% of them are former foster kids, and our death row inmates are over 80%. Why this matters? What does this have to do with child abuse prevention? It's not just foster care. It has to do so much with trauma. And that's what I began to really understand at a deep, deep level. And what I really truly understood is that many people didn't understand what was happening in foster care and didn't understand the cost of foster care in our communities. So when we do foster care really, really well, for every dollar we spend, we lose $3.64. Right? So if we were running a widget factory and we were making widgets, if they cost us $1, right? If we only charged $1, but they were costing us $3.64 to make, we wouldn't stay in business very long. And by the way, this is when we do foster care really well, which is in less than 1% of cases that we do it really well. When we do it how it's typically done in 99% of cases, for every dollar we spend, we lose $9.55. And so what I realized early on in my advocacy work is whether I can talk to your heart or whether I can talk to your wallet, what I knew was we needed trauma-informed systems to help us change the way we see things. And that I didn't want to spend my time talking about all the bad. I wanted to talk about what can we do to change, right? This is why I can't watch the news. They're really great at telling us everything that's wrong in the world, regardless of what your format watching your news is. Very few people are good at giving us solutions. So what do we do about it? How do we actually prevent abuse? What would that look like to have systems that do that? And so the thing that we have to understand first is what is trauma and how insidious trauma is, how it happens on such a global scale. It's not just happening to a few people over there. It is happening universally across the board. And so when we begin to understand that trauma is our experience or an event that happens to us that leaves us overwhelmed with an inability to cope, right? That we're powerless. It's important to know that it's not a competition. My trauma isn't any less important than Sylvia's trauma, and that's not any less important than Stephanie's trauma. We're not in a competition with each other. It's the things that happen to us that overwhelm our ability to cope. And the other really critical piece to this, and I see this happening more and more in our world today, is that everyone says, that's not so bad. Let me tell you what happened to me. It's not a competition. We can have empathy for everybody and where they are in their experience and their time frame. The other critical component here is that for some of us, trauma happens so frequently, it is our normal. We actually don't know a world without it. And I think that gets minimized a lot, that people assume we know what that's like. But for me, that wasn't the case. I tell the story very often of my experience coming home from elementary school and how I knew I was safe when I came in my front door. And by the way, the walk from my school to my house every day after school was a painful one. And it was painful because my mom often told me that she was going to leave me and disappear. And so I would often do that walk wondering if my mom would still be there when I got home. And so I would walk in the door, and there were 3 ways that my brain developed knowing I was safe. 1, my mother was there. I wasn't always sure she would be. And she, frankly, as I got older, wasn't always. But there were 3 things that existed. There were drugs on my coffee room table, there was a gun nearby, and my mom was very often with some strange guy in her bedroom. When those 3 things existed, I was safe. And when I see that, most people get a queasy feeling in their gut. They say, that's not normal, Shen. That's not a safe environment. But that was my experience. I didn't know an experience outside of that. I did not come home to a snack every day after school and a nice conversation. That wasn't my experience. And so my experience was normal to me. And so when I was removed from that situation, when I went into my first day of foster care, my brain was still waiting for those things to tell it was safe. Because see, when those things weren't there, my brain would go on hyper alert. And so we need to understand each other's experiences and have empathy that we are each having a different kind of experience in this world. Now, I think most of you on this call are at least familiar with adverse childhood experiences and understand how critical understanding adverse childhood experiences are to what's happening for us. For those of you who may not, this is actually a study that started in San Diego, California in the mid-90s with a doctor who was working with morbidly obese patients and eventually realized that his patients who are having difficulty losing weight were saying, yes, these things happened to me before the age of 18 to at least 4 or more of these events. And that because of that, there were some lifelong health outcomes. That's a critical component to understanding if we are going to change trauma in communities. If we are really going to talk about what's happened to people, if we're going to truly highlight individual stories and move forward. And so understanding that there is a stronger link between childhood trauma and addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes. Understanding that 2/3 of addicts report being abused as children is critical to our understanding. And also critical to our understanding is that these are people who admit to being abused. Many of us do not even understand that the things that have happened to us were abuse. And we know that if we all had the same definition of abuse, this number would increase dramatically. Because again, many of us take the things that happen to us as just normal. We assume because it's the only experience that we've had that that is what it's like for everybody. And we do not know another way in which to see our work. This is critical in understanding how many of us get caught and trapped into our fight, flight, freeze, appease response. That when that cortisol is released into our brain, that it literally traps us in survival mode. And when we are trapped in survival mode, we cannot access things like logic, reasoning, understanding, goal setting, planning. This is why you can get locked into poverty. This is why you can get locked into your trauma. This is why you can get locked into hopelessness and helplessness. Because when you are surviving, you cannot think about what these day-to-day decisions, what that impact will be a week from now, a month from now, or a year from now. You're only worried about surviving the moment. And that's why it can look like they shouldn't have made those decisions, when the truth is there was no other alternative to survive. And so it's a really critical piece to understanding and preventing. Now, of course, when we talk about things like ACEs, when we talk about physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, when we talk about physical and emotional neglect, when we talk about substance abuse in the home, domestic violence in the home, incarcerated relatives, mental illness, or the death, divorce, or separation from a biological parent, those are all significant traumas. All of us would agree. But we also know there are other traumas and adversities that occur. And I think those don't get talked about as much. And it's a real shame, because it's a real reason why we're locked in the predicament we're in. And so while it's very easy to talk about household violence and trauma and pin that on individuals and individual choices, where I think our society struggles very often is talking about the trauma that occurs within our communities and within our environment. Lack of jobs contribute to stress in the home that can cause some of those ACEs to pop out. Poverty, poor water, structural violence and race trauma, racism, historical trauma, substandard schools, these all contribute and can get into the soil that has the stress and strain on households. But we also know that there's things that can happen in our environment. And as Californians, you know this better than anyone. When there's wildfires, when there's earthquakes, when there is devastation, environmental devastation, it takes a toll on a community. Even wealthy communities, it takes their toll, right? We saw this globally with the COVID-19 pandemic. And that when these things happen environmentally, it has an impact on our communities. And that impact in our communities has impact within individual households. So we can't always look at this as social determinants of health, right? Through the social determinants of health lens, it's individual decisions that cause community problems, that cause societal problems, that cause structural problems, right? So forth and so on. But there's also structural determinants of health, and realizing that it's a two-way street, that natural disasters and environmental things can lead to problems within the community, that can lead to problems within the household. And so us understanding this two-way street and understanding that there are prevention services at each level of this is really critical in how we can move forward. The other piece that's really critical to this is to begin to take that universal precautions lens. Now, those of you who are in the masterclass with me, you know I say this over and over and over again, but it's really important. So universal precaution was this term that was coined in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. And it was really this idea that before AIDS happened, we would only sometimes wear a mask and gloves, right? And then after the AIDS epidemic, it turned out we were wearing masks and gloves even less. And then we realized it's actually really healthy, not just for patients, but for doctors and nurses and staff treating patients, that we should wear gloves and masks all the time. And that idea became known as universal precaution, that regardless of your health concerns, we wear a glove and mask because it's safe for you and patients, and it's safe for us as caregivers. When we're talking about trauma, the same thing applies. Trauma is so invasive and it's everywhere that if we use a universal precaution, if we treat everyone from a universal precaution space, we can keep ourselves safe as well as other people without re-traumatizing them. And so it's a critical, critical piece to this work. And for as much as I get to talk about adverse childhood experiences, where I would prefer to spend my time talking with you all is positive childhood experiences. That when you only know someone's trauma history, again, you really only know one piece of them. And we have to think about that piece of intersectionality, that even in all the trauma that I had with my mother, even in all the trauma that I had within my foster care experience, there are positive memories. And we know that the things that tell us about outcomes in life come down to really two things: your sense of belonging, who are your people, and how do you fit? And do you have a safe space to talk about feelings? In that order, these are our two biggest predictor of lifelong outcomes. So as I began thinking about child abuse prevention, I'm thinking about how do we ensure that everyone, children and adults, feel like they belong somewhere? And how do we make it safe for all of us to talk about feelings and begin that parallel process with others? We also know that it's critical to build the skill of resilience. Now, for a long time, many people believed that resilience was just something lucky people had, right? That it was genetic to you, and if you were lucky, you were born with it. But we know that resilience is a learned trait, and we can learn it through positive, stable adult relationships, our connection to faith, spirituality, or cultural traditions, and or a mastery of a life skill. So all of these are really critical in our ability to grow our resilience. But what we know and what all of these have in common is a sense of belonging, a sense of connection. And so how do we nurture, as we think about prevention, how do we nurture belonging and letting both adults and youth feel like they belong? And the thing that I propose to do this is the paradigm shift. This is something that I've been working on for a long time, both personally and professionally. And it's getting people to stop with the language of what's wrong with you. And I would be very dishonest if I told you I never use the phrase, what's wrong with you, right? I live in a world and where I see things that just do not make sense to me. And I say all the time, what is wrong with that person? Now, I am better at saying it in my head than out loud most days, but still, I am still trying to stop myself. As many of you know, Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry just wrote a best-selling book that's called What's Happened to You. And if we could get people to move from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you, I think we would be doing great work. And I think when we talk about prevention, this is a great step in prevention. But I have this sort of as my yellow light, use with caution, because it's not just about what happened to me, it's also what's happening in real time. Most of us are living in active trauma. There are things happening to us that are overwhelming us on a daily basis. And so we need to see that whole version of us. And what my real goal is to move us from what's wrong with you to what's strong with you. Can we begin seeing behaviors not as a deficit-based, but as an asset-based? How can we begin seeing behaviors through our strength? And I apply this to myself first, because even when I tell you what's wrong with me, right? And there's plenty. I've got a long list, by the way, that we can go through. We had a mindfulness earlier talking about our inside critic, and it's like, oh, mine's loud and strong and proud, right? And so I can tell you that I'm oppositional. I love to try to find the loophole. I don't like rules. Rules don't apply to me. But when I see that not from my problem base, when I see that from my strength base, that I do want to advocate for a different perspective, that I do think there's a lot of gray in this world and not black and white, that when I do think that there are ways in which other people's experiences and their lived experiences can shift us, that's why. So when I say that I'm being demanding, it's because I know what I want and I'm outspoken. And frankly, I'm a little tired and can't hold my tongue anymore, right? And so can we begin seeing, one of the things that I want to ask everybody who's on this call is really think of those behaviors that drive you crazy, maybe from your own children or other children or people within your community. And how can you actually begin seeing them through a strength-focused lens? Because when we do that, the opportunities change. The path forward changes. We suddenly have a lot more opportunities than we did when we looked at it only from the problem. And so I want to leave us with sort of one final piece before I open it up for some Q&A. I feel like I'm right on time, Sylvia, here. Look at me go. And so what I want you to think about is a healthy baby, right? When that healthy baby is born, it can do 5 things without any assistance from us. It can breathe. It knows that it's hungry. It has emotions and it loves to share them with us. It knows how to sleep and it can poop. But when trauma and stress enters our body, think about what happens to these 5 basics. Think about how our breathing changes and how our breathing gets much shallower. Think about, for those of us who stress eat, right? When we're stressed, we eat everything in sight or we eat nothing at all, right? It depends on where you are on the spectrum. And then our emotions. There's those of us who can't control our emotions and those of us who hold on to our emotions so much that we can't share anything. There's those of us who can't sleep and those of us who can barely get out of bed. And then when stress enters, there's those of us who are constipated, and of course, those of us who have diarrhea. It's not fun to talk about, but it's really critical. Because this is what I mean when I say we got to get back to the basics. Before we can do any other work, we have to make sure the basics are covered. Are we just doing the basic things to care for ourselves? Now, if you've been in foster care, I'm going to let you pass on this homework assignment. But if you've never been in foster care, I challenge you that when we get off our call, hopefully you'll get up, stretch, walk around, maybe go outside. The first stranger you see, I want to challenge you to imagine, as the person you are today, what it would be like to move in with that stranger. Take your car, your driver's license, all your credit cards, but you're going to go live with that stranger. How long would it take you to be comfortable in that stranger's home? Tomorrow you can get up, you can go to your job, but you're going to return and go back to that stranger's house. How many days, weeks, or months might it take you to be comfortable in that stranger's home? And I ask you that question because that is what you are asking 500,000 children to do today. You are asking them to be on their best behavior in a stranger's home when not only do they have their own traumatic experiences beforehand, but for many of us as adults with driver's licenses and credit cards that would allow us to escape in all kinds of ways, many of us would be uncomfortable for a very long time. And yet we have children placed in that system who then we're also asking to be on their very best behavior all of the time. And so we really need to come together to begin viewing through this new lens, to begin seeing that at its core, what all of us need are love, safety, and stability. I'm super grateful for our time together today. I know that we have more time together, and so I thought it would be best perhaps, if I can find it on my screen to stop sharing, that if anyone had any questions, we do that, or that we take time back to go care for ourselves and our extra time that we have together. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shen. And if everyone could give Shen a round of applause or a little heart emoji, whatever your heart desires.
Oh, thank you guys so much.
I would also like to say, Shen, I've we've worked together already, and every time I hear you, every time it it fills my heart even more, but also it still gives me chills, and then you fill me with urgency to keep doing this work, right? That it's not just a one day thing, it's ongoing, and like people are saying, you're captivating us, you're fueling our passion for the work that we need to do, that is vital and it's urgent. And thank you so much for just bringing up so much for us in terms of feelings and what we want to do. And it's you're very touching to all of us, like in terms of your story and the successful person and amazing woman that you are.
Oh, Sylvia, I appreciate that. I love your use of the word urgency. That actually fills my heart. I love the urgency piece. I've been saying this a lot lately because as social things are happening in our society, right? Like we have strong feelings about them. And I'm just, I sort of touched on the MSU shooting that was like literally in the backyard for me. And there's foster youth on that campus that I mentor. And so for a lot of reasons, it's close to my heart. But this work is also tiring and exhausting, as you all know. And so I too get tired and exhausted. And I think I just can't do it anymore. And to be quite honest, right before the MSU mass shooting, I was thinking, how much more time do I have? Right? I can just feel this change in me happening. And to your point about urgency, Sylvia, when it happened and it was so close, right? It's really what makes me double down on this work, because I know that this is the solution. So we can get caught up in all the politics about what should the new gun control laws be and what should we do. At the end of the day, and I have opinions about all of that, trust me, but at the end of the day, I know how we really heal communities and how we really heal people is this work and people feeling like they belong. And so for me, every time a big tragedy happens, it's like, nope, this means I've got to stay a little bit longer in this work, because like Sylvia, there's just this urgency for me. Like there's one more person, there's one more group of people, there's one more organization we can shift that will shift something for somebody. And so I just appreciate that, Sylvia, because it's like, it's my reminder too of like, okay, that's why I keep saying yes to Sylvia. That's why I keep saying yes to other people, is this is the work. I truly, truly in my heart of hearts believe that this is the work that will change people's lives. And not just me, all of us, and the way in which we all translate that to do the work differently.
Thank you, Shen. I know, and like I said earlier, some of you have already gone through the Trauma Informed Masterclass. Some of you are going through it now, and we will be continuing to bring that because it's valuable. But we're excited because we're looking at doing it in person, because this kind of work really makes a huge difference in person. And so if we could we could do this training in 3 days as opposed to 3 to 6 months, we will be better for that. So Shen and I are planning to do that. And we are also doing, at the end of June, for people that have already taken the training or are in the process of taking it, there's the opportunity to train the trainer. That will also be in person. And we most likely will have a second train the trainer. So really, we invite you to be part of this. Today was just a little tiny little piece of what Shen offers us, but really anybody that is here that has gone through it or is going through it can tell you what an amazing training it is, and really how it shifts our mindsets, and it also shifts just how we respond to things and how we're doing things. So again, I continue to encourage and invite anybody who hasn't gone through it to really, really consider doing it. You'll see it's a great opportunity, and it's perfect for our community. We need that here.
So I do see Kimberly has her hand up.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for acknowledging me, Stephanie. I just wanted to say to Shenandoah that you are awesome. You are
Oh, thank you.
you are so awesome on so many levels. And I'm sure you kind of know it or you've heard it, but I think it's so important to just make sure that you truly understand how awesome you are for just being candid, for being vulnerable in a space of strangers, and now knowing even more about your background. And that takes a lot of courage to be able to say, I've been through all of this. I would really prefer not to share all of this stuff with a bunch of strangers, but knowing that it's going to help us to be able to help the community and others. And having worked with foster youth for many, many, many years, and right now I am on the board of directors for a home here in Palm. It's called Michaela's House of Hope, and it's opening up. Our grand opening is actually this Saturday, and it's helping young girls who have aged out of the foster care program who still need help and assistance. But when I hear your story, and I, even talking about, the whole CSEC part of it in sexual, exploitation, and it's just so true. And I know it's so true from just the history of where I've worked at and what I've seen and what I know. And so I thank you for literally stripping away all of that fear and whatever else it was, to just say, I'm going to be here and I'm going to share this, and please take this and help other people. I thank you. I thank you.
Oh, Kimberly, so much. One of the things that we say in the masterclass all the time is this parallel process, and that it's inside out work, right? And so each of us have the power to do it. And the truth is, Kimberly, the reason I can be so vulnerable is because I need all of you to be vulnerable. I need all of you to bring all of the pieces of you, not part of your pieces, not some of your pieces, but all of your pieces, the good pieces, the bad pieces, the messy pieces, the wonderful pieces, because that's how kids heal. So many of us say, well, I have to stay professional. I have to look like I'm holding it together. No, you don't. Some of us need to learn that it's okay to break down and still get back up the next day, right? And we only learn that because we see other people doing it. And if everybody is pretending and walking through life pretending, and I think, we have social media to kind of blame for this, right? I'm going to call them out big time for this, but we live in this pretend world that then when we have bad feelings, even adults don't know how to process those, because we feel like we're no longer allowed to have those pieces and parts of us. And the truth is I think many of us need to strip down and get a little naked and just say, here it is, take it or leave it. This is what I got today. This is the best I can give you today. And I think if we could do that, if we could be in that parallel process with each other, that's really when healing begins. It's because we need all of those pieces, the really good parts of Kimberly, and then the parts Kimberly wishes none of us ever saw, right? We need all of that, because that's what makes you you, and then that's what makes it safe for me to be me. Yay, look at us getting time back, Sylvia. I don't like to keep a group. It's people need more time, not less time.
That's right. No, again, Shen, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending. And like we said, we're going to keep this work going. Shen's not going anywhere. Even if she thinks it's time, I'm not giving her that kind of time. Nope.
Hey, that's a good
thank
reminder.
you, everybody. Yeah, but thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
You also